have Julie Dick. Julie is a relentless advocate for hurricane and sea level rise preparedness, conservation of coastal resources, and responsible planning. She has successfully advocated for measures to protect South Florida's potable water supply, maintain the urban development boundary in the county, and plan for sea level rise, adapt conservation and sustainability measures, reverse decisions to expand landfills into wetlands, and restore the Everglades ecosystem. Thank you so much, Julie.
Yep. Good morning. Thank you, Tiffany. That was a great overview, and I think really important information to be thinking about the broader drainage system that we're a part of with the Everglades and how that affects our water supply. For those of us who own real estate in South Florida, it's hard to think about the impacts of climate change on that real estate. I mean, we're actually in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times in the last couple of weeks because climate change is already impacting our real estate values. It's no surprise to many of us that 22 of the most 25 vulnerable cities to sea level rise are in Florida, in the United States. So many of these challenges we're all dealing with as a state. I think we need to learn from what other cities and counties have already dealt with. For purposes of that, I think the Florida Keys are actually a really excellent example of a community that's had to deal with these issues of climate change in a really sort of fast-forwarded manner that the rest of us haven't yet had to experience and deal with to such an extreme. They have very finite resources, very limited land, and they're actually designated as an area of critical state concern by the state of Florida. And because of that, they have special considerations that they need to include in their planning and how they're moving forward as a city. That area of critical state concern goes to their water quality, the sensitive ecological environment surrounding the Florida Keys, also the need to conserve and protect public assets like the Navy installation in Key West. But really, most importantly, it also requires that the Florida Keys can evacuate in 24 hours for a hurricane. And that's a critical component that's really informed so much of the land use and planning decisions and how the Florida Keys is actually developed. David Rice, the current mayor of Monroe County, was speaking recently in Isla Mirada about some of the challenges they're facing. And he said, that 50% of the roads in the Keys will need to be elevated by 2060 by their estimations. For the Florida Keys, it's costing them many millions of dollars per mile to elevate roads. And they've come out and said, they're going to have to be selective. They're not going to be able to elevate all the roads in the Florida Keys. They're not going to be able to protect all the property in the Florida Keys. And they've developed policies and planning that's really set them up and set reasonable expectations for their residents to understand that. So some of the tools they've used have really included directing some of the development to scarified land. It's really difficult to develop in the Florida Keys on any land that has native habitat or anything else. They use transfer development rights, where there are offshore islands. There are 1,700 or so offshore islands in the Florida Keys. You can't transfer development rights to those islands, and they're very hard to develop. Because think about being able to evacuate in 24 hours. If you're throwing offshore islands into the mix, it really complicates the evacuation concerns. They've created incentives for things like cisterns for collecting rainwater, a sustainability action plan. So all of those things have been important in their planning, but they've also have a rate of growth ordinance. And the state of Florida has mandated that rate of growth for the Florida Keys and come in and said, you have 1,900 or so units of development for all of unincorporated Monroe County. And then the county's built out. It can't sustain more growth because with that, with more development than that, even where they are now, it's hard for them to get people out safely in the event of a hurricane. And let's think about why they have that policy in place. I think Irma is a good example to start thinking about those issues. After Hurricane Irma hit the Florida Keys, it was a full 2 days before emergency operations for the county and the city actually had communications. They didn't have an ability to communicate The naval installation in Key West wasn't able to bring its employees back for 2 weeks, and the emergency room in Key West wasn't able to open for 7 days after the storm. So they're really not equipped to deal with a population in that community after a storm hits. These are the types of concerns that other communities across the state are going to need to be thinking about and planning for. And for those of us in Miami-Dade County, we too are going to start feeling some of the constraints on our land and what we can use and can't use, and need to be thinking much more strategically about the resources we have and being selective about what we're investing in and where we're concentrating our development. So one of the issues that's come up since Irma in the Florida Keys is affordable housing. And the Keys had an affordable housing crisis before Hurricane Irma hit. Now it's really a crisis. I mean, I've talked to clients and residents in the Keys who are talking about moving because they can't find the people to perform the basic services to maintain their homes. An organization I used to work with, it's called BPI in Chicago, and they had an affordable housing campaign. The idea was people you need affordable housing, and you see pictures in the trains of teachers and police officers, firefighters. The same thing holds true for all of South Florida. We need people who have public service jobs, service economy jobs, to be able to afford to live in the areas we live in. But that also requires serious decisions about how we develop. So in the Florida Keys, to solve the affordable housing crisis they're facing right now, Governor Scott has said, you know what, Florida Keys, you get 1,300 allocations permits for developing affordable housing. The problem is those new housing units are not being subtracted from the 1,900 units that they have for the entire county before they're built out and really can evacuate for a storm. So we see this really, the resiliency planning, the climate readiness solutions coming really face to face with affordable housing problems. And because those plans weren't deconflicted, because they weren't really thinking through the sea level rise problems in relation to affordable housing, the county is now faced with making some really tough decisions, and they're going to have to decide, whether they want to actually pull some of the affordable housing credits from the amount of development that's going to be allowed in the Keys overall. So these are decisions that I think all of the municipalities in South Florida are going to have to face. And, many will develop resiliency plans, sustainability plans, sea level rise adaptation plans. Coastal cities in Florida are now required to have sea level rise planning as part of their comprehensive plan. But it's really important that these are comprehensive views of how we're looking at all of it, our governing. So the building code needs to be updated. The stormwater management plan is going to play into that. And even affordable housing and housing plans need to be taking into consideration the sea level rise and climate planning that's going on. So we can't do sea level rise planning in a vacuum. And it's really important that, as we're going through this process, we're really thinking holistically about all the aspects of government and incorporating this planning into it. Another issue that comes up quite a bit is coordination of public and private activities. And many people here have probably heard of the situation in Miami Beach, where they raised the roads. They raised Purdy Avenue or Purdy Road, where there are a few restaurants at the end of that street there, and those restaurants flooded. They had significant flooding after the roads were raised. I think someone actually turned off the pump station nearby there. It's maybe problematic design that was able to happen. But what happened was the insurance agent came out, the adjuster came out and said, you know what, we're not going to pay your claim because this is no longer a first-story restaurant. This is a basement. And it ended up having to go through the reinsurance industry, through the chief resiliency officer in Miami Beach, working on that. And eventually it worked out for that property owner, in that property owner's favor for their insurance claim. But it shows that in this process, as we're making changes and changing our public infrastructure, it really needs to be in close coordination with the surrounding private communities. I think about, hear of communities where people are buying homes in very vulnerable locations and maybe building elevated homes. They have stilts. They're ready. They're ready for the next storm. They're for a Category 5 storm. They're not going to flood. But then, do they know what the level of services that the city or county, that the South Florida Water Management District are going to continue to provide? So those people are building homes with the anticipation that the government's going to continue to provide the flood control services into the future life of their property, that the government's going to continue to provide access to the roads, water and sewer services, everything else. And that's not a given, and that's not guaranteed. That's where it becomes very important for people in the public and the residents and property owners and business owners in the community to have reasonable expectations and a plan that they can rely upon for what the cities and counties are going to do. So they know that they'll have services and there's going to be investment in services to a certain degree. So there's an evolving area of law with regard to level of services that counties and cities need to provide. But essentially, cities have an obligation to maintain an existing level of service. But they don't have an obligation necessarily to upgrade that level of service. And the cities and counties are going to need to figure out ways to sort of protect themselves and the expectations of their residents to share the level of service that they plan to continue to provide and the investments that they want to make. Real estate disclosures are one way that some communities are dealing with those kind of issues. I want to go into a couple of the other tools sort of available for folks. The state of Florida, actually in our state legislature, they've gone through the steps of actually requiring, as I mentioned, sea level rise planning for coastal communities. And that's through the Comprehensive Development Master Plan. The CDMP, as I was explaining in Monroe County, has excellent tools not just for that coastal element, but that's where the cities, the counties, municipalities are thinking about these bigger issues and going through a public process and public hearing process to figure out the land use, the zoning, all these different issues that are going to come into play in this vision and plan for how our cities will look in the future. And sea level rise planning needs to be a part of that. The Florida legislature also provided the tool of adaptation action areas for these communities. And through those adaptation action areas, we can use tools like land trusts. So for example, in a city where we know certain areas are vulnerable and maybe we're not going to invest in the services to continue flood control in those areas, we can be thinking about how we can buy out those properties and start using them for flood attenuation, how they can be restored to a natural system. There are a number of zoning tools and different theories on zoning. We have adaptation action areas, restoration areas, growth areas, where folks can decide, there are certain areas we're going to commit to adapting and make those investments in. Other areas we might be looking at restoring to a natural state and providing room for water, so we can sort of sacrifice those and to improve the flood control for other properties. And then growth areas, maybe our highest lying areas, those are the areas where we're going to be able to grow and invest in further development. University of Florida in their model comp plans, they talk about managed relocation area zones, accommodation zones, and protection zones. So that's a hard thing to start thinking about in South Florida. But do we have a plan in the long run for these communities, for the most vulnerable, lowest lying communities, where we can manage relocation and ease the financial burden of those residents who may have to face that in the future? And then we can accommodate in certain areas and really do a lot to protect other areas. I think there are, as has been mentioned, we have so many really great resources in this part of the state between the South Florida Regional Planning Council, the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, Regional Climate Compact, and then also now 100 Resilient Cities. Through 100 Resilient Cities, the county, Miami Beach, City of Miami are going through a resilience plan. That's an opportunity for every city in the county to look at that county resilience plan and also think about how they can develop a resilience plan for city that will plug into that plan and coordinate with those efforts. The compact, the climate compact, has amazing resources on policy, on sort of things that cities and communities can be adopting to sort of plan for their future and make these decisions. It does require hiring the staff, hiring the consultants, the attorneys, and getting the stakeholder input from all the members of the community to make these decisions and move forward with them. We have the resources there, but it's really on the cities at this point to take the next step and prepare themselves. I think, we have a history in South Florida in particular of manipulating water through the Everglades restoration, and previous to that, the Central and South Florida project. We've manipulated and drained the swamp, so to speak. So there are a lot of areas of Florida that we can live in that previously we wouldn't have been able to. But through that process, we've also created a lot of problems. We have estuaries that are suffering massive algal blooms on both coasts. We have a seagrass die-off in Florida Bay because not enough fresh water is getting down there. We'll lose land in the southern part of Miami-Dade County because we don't have fresh water maintaining those marshes, and the pushback of the sea level rise is impacting that. So and our water supply is also impacted and will benefit the more we can invest in Everglades restoration and these big picture solutions. But we also need to learn from Everglades restoration about what has worked and what has not worked in terms of manipulating our water flows and everything else. And we're at a point where we really need to ramp up our plans and really include much greater planning for sea level rise and storm surge that we can expect in the future. We're at a moment in Miami where we really have an opportunity to revision the future of this region. I spent 11 years in Chicago, and Daniel Burnham's plan for the city of Chicago is still celebrated 100 years later. That came about because there was a fire. There was a fire that destroyed much of downtown Chicago, but as a result of the plan and forward thinking, there's a livable city with a public transportation system that works, and green spaces and plazas, public spaces that function, and it's walkable, generally a walkable community that the design and plan of that community has helped the economy thrive. We have an opportunity to do that in Miami-Dade County and in this region right now, but we need to be selective, and we need to be very thoughtful and get all the stakeholders involved to make these difficult decisions. With that, I want to pass it on to the next speaker. I was not told whether I need to do an introduction, but I think these planning issues are very critical, but we also need to figure out ways to pay for them and to pay for the resilience that's needed. So the next speaker will be able to help us with that from the British Council. Thank you very much.